Thank you, sir. Please have a seat. Now, we would like to welcome the first speaker, Mr. M.S. Chattri. He is an ecologist, country working as fellow at Development Foundation, Bangalore. His research currently involves understanding the crisis of biodiversity and impact of human society in India, human degraded semi-arid tropics. He has worked with University of Mysore, Utkal University, Tumkur University, Wildlife Institute of India, and Center for Ecological Science at IIC. Please, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. So what I intend to do in this presentation is to sort of take you through what people study in the name of culture in something called cross-cultural management. So cross-cultural management has picked up as a very important domain within management sciences, specifically in America, and now it is spreading all over the places. And there is a claim that if you take it seriously, the problem associated with culture that emerges from culture within a business corporation could be handled by the knowledge that is available through the research that has been done over the last 4 decades. Now, if you want to get an idea of how the culture gets studied in cross-cultural management, so my question is, where is culture in cross-cultural management? And my argument would be that there is no place for culture in cross-cultural management studies, which is there in the domain. So I will start from this. So one of the very important thinker who was interested in measuring and understanding the role of culture in culture and management claims that, look, the corporations have become global today. People from different backgrounds, different countries come and work in the same corporation. These multinational corporations will have the leaders and manager of this organization had to be aware of the background from where these employees come and interact with them. So many researchers and authors have already written about the culture, and there is a lot of talk about models and frameworks that are used in studying culture. And there are 2 important things which plays a very important role in management. Apparently, one is called national culture, another one is called organization culture. And if you take them seriously, you will have an idea of how management literature solves the problem of the corporations by taking into this cue. Now, if you go back, so what is this idea of national culture? So one of the most pioneering, so-called pioneering author in 1980s who came up with this idea of cross-cultural management, Hofstede says, in research on cultural difference, nationality, the passport that one holds, should therefore be used with care. He gives that caution. But he says that is the only feasible way of understanding cultural differences. Therefore, he goes on to say that we all intuitively recognize that typically American, typically German, typically Japanese, etc. And now see, because we use that way, we make sense of the world in that way. So what we do is that we measure the nationality of individuals and add certain variables to understand what differences people from different nationality have. And that would give us some kind of an idea of what cultural differences are. To go back, if you take that very seriously, more or less this is the idea that in management literature everyone has taken. And this is very popular. Even in India now, in classrooms people teach something called national culture, and they study it. And if you look at it, there is some kind of a relationship between nationality and culture that they're presuming. Now, one of the difficulty of this talk on national cultures is as simple as this, that let's say there are different nations in the world, and every nation is recognized by, let's say, there are borders, and do these borders influence culture? So let's say we go to somewhere in Wagah border, the other side of the border there is this Pakistani culture, and this side of the border there is this Indian culture. So can we really talk in that way? So there is this assumption that people one nation have this homogeneous culture. This is what Hofstede and Tromperonas, everybody says. But if you actually ask, take the situation of India, do you want to say that there is a South Asian culture? Or you wanted to say that there are distinct Indian culture, Pakistani culture, Bangladeshi culture, Nepali culture? I mean, do you wanted to speak in that way? Or let's come down further. So there are Malayalis, there are Tamilians, there are Kannadigas, and we all recognize some kind of differences or the other between this. We keep talking in this simple language. That's typically Mallu. That's like a Kannadiga kind of thing. And all these gets actually clubbed as some kind of differences which are associated with culture. Nonetheless, nobody says what differences would really make the difference into cultural difference. And the claim is that if you study some kind of this national culture, that you can really solve some concrete problems that is being confronted by some individual or the other inside a corporation. Now let's go a little further and see what kind of problems are being confronted. So I wanted to put a description of the problem that is given by an American manager. Now, see, this is the kind of problem that an American company has when they are dealing with people from Islamic countries. Suppose you are trying to communicate in an Islamic culture, anywhere from North Africa to Middle East to Indonesia, what an American might see as a perfectly reasonable goal, such as construct the new building on schedule, a Muslim might see as irreligious because Muslims believe that human efforts are determined by the will of Allah, not by a schedule. In fact, this description, you have a series of description of this kind where there was always a problem between American entrepreneurs and the people who worked in West Asia, Middle Eastern region and African region, where they could not actually strike a deal on the appropriate schedule. Because these construction projects, some of them have actually believed that you can't really decide the time, and sometimes it didn't work out. And this is the nature of the problem the managers really confronted in really dealing with the situation. Now, if you go back to the national culture discussion that we had, now there is this introduction of something called Islamic culture by the description. Now, do you want to say that a Muslim from a North African region, a Muslim from a Middle Eastern, Saudi Arabia and India, all of them belong to something called Islamic culture? What do we want to say out of it? So there is this Islamic culture, which is it the case that this Islamic culture is very different from the national culture? Then what is the property of this national culture which makes it distinguishable from some religious or linguistic kind of groups is unclear. So one of the point of showing this slide is saying that this way of talking about national culture cannot be taken seriously in terms of solving the concrete problem that are being confronted by the manager who has put in X amount of money. He has this budgetary plan. He wants to get this amount of profit. He wants to hire X number of people. He really wants to know how to solve the problem. And the available descriptions in terms of national culture does not help us to solve these problems. In other words, if you do a survey of 40 years of research on what is being labeled as a very important aspect of the study of national culture in management, which is the proxy for understanding cultural difference. Now, nationality, regional differences, religious groups, ethnic groups, all kind of differences that exist in the world could be simply listed as the cultural differences. Nobody knows, for example, is culture meaning nationality? Is culture means some religious identity? If you take these questions, the answer hardly doesn't exist. Even though they have confronted this question, they have not answered, they have brushed these questions aside. Now, it gets complicated if you go and encounter and talk to people who are corporates. They talk about this business culture, organization culture, corporate culture. And the person who defended the claim that national cultures are important gives another statement in the same book that initially I showed. And the statement says, yeah, there are issues, but if you build a set of rules within the organization, which is called organization culture, then all this cultural problem could be dealt with properly. So it means what? already the 40 years of cultural research, the culture and management research goes in vain, because the claim is, oh, if you set up the organization culture, then culture, all this national culture doesn't really influence you. But in the very next page, the same person would go and say, it's very important to understand national culture, because it's very difficult to impose one kind of an organization culture to all areas where this company subsidiaries operate. So the examples that are given, for example, the standard operating procedures which are useful for America may not be useful to run the firm in Singapore. I mean, these are the kind of contrasts which are given. So it's unclear what these organization cultures do, what role do they play in understanding culture and management. I'm just trying to add this, that there are any number of loose ways that the culture gets used. Now, we'll go a little further, that from yesterday workshop also some of you have already pointed out that there is this entire group of people who are sitting and actually measuring cultural difference. So there is this dispute whether you have 5 dimensions of culture that requires to be measured, whether it is 7 dimensions of the culture or 10 dimensions of the culture. So there are multiple alternatives. So yesterday there was also this discussion around this power distance relationship and masculinity versus femininity and any number of things. And when we started digging out and figuring out what are they measuring in terms of differences that they are considering as cultural differences, you can look at it. So there are 2 important things that they are trying to measure. You can follow it in the quote. So what is considered right and wrong, which is norms, and good and bad are values. Now, these seem to be very important in actually developing an understanding of what cultural difference. Now, to put it simply, the cross-cultural management actually formulates it as differences in norms and values across the nation is cultural difference. So that's why there is a heavy dependence for these dimensions, the Hofstede dimensions, Schwartz dimensions, and all these dimensions. The heavy dependence on global value survey, Chinese value survey. So there are different value surveys that they depend on for the data. Now the question, is it the case that norms differ across the culture? How do you know that norms really differ across the culture? Take this, thou shalt not kill. I mean, is there any culture in the world which would say, oh, you can go and kill people or can kill anything? So you don't have. In fact, if you carefully look at what are norms, one could even go and say that norms appear invariant across the culture. They don't change across the culture. Is there a norm which change across the culture? It's very difficult to really talk in that way. Going further, there is another set of things that gets measured. Now, there is this idea that values, differences in values are extremely crucial, like earlier I have pointed out. Now, there is also this treatment that, say, the earlier citation, if you have read, it is indicating that valuing the norms are very important and it varies across the culture. Now, what does it mean to say that there is this valuing the norms? Do all the culture value the norms in the same way, or do they differ? Now, if they differ, how do you measure them? Now, these are the questions which have never been taken up and answered so far. Now, one of the consequences of this unclarity of usage of this word culture in all possible way is this, that anybody can come and say anything about cultural difference. So you go and measure any variable and you can come up with any cooked up story and you can keep talking about it. And managers have almost come to the conclusion that this talk on cultural and management is absolutely useless for them because it does not solve their concrete situations inside the company. Because there is a person who is upset, there is some communication breakdown inside the company. In all these situations, what will we do with these indices and dimensions, all these statistical tests that are developed and measured? None of them is giving you any guideline of what to do. It doesn't tell you. And you can also keep generally talking about, this gives an opportunity in building, there are differences in values. So Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is a principal value that Indian culture. I mean, if you know, for example, what this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is, the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is a story which comes in one particular story of Panchatantra where a monkey talks to a crocodile. And monkey wants to save itself, and there is the story, oh, don't eat me like this. There is this big, we are all part of this bigger world, we are one family. And suddenly somebody comes and could easily say that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is an important value of management, Indian principle. So like this, since you don't understand what cultures are, what differences make something into cultural differences, it has created an opportunity for people to come and say whatever they wanted to, and it does not really communicate anything. Now, one word of clarification is this, that the available literature shows us that the research that treats culture in this way is not productive. Does not mean that culture does not play any role in management. It's just the fact that these questions have been formulated badly. We are not in a state of really talking anything with the existing literature. We need to think new possible ways of how do we understand the role of culture in managing a business corporation. So with this, I will close my talk.
You can announce for the questions, sir.
3 questions. If you have any.
So it was a very interesting talk about how, in fact, a lot of questions about how culture may not be dimensionalized or characterized. So I was actually looking at the last point that you made about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. You said the stories appears in Panchatantra, and I'm not aware of the background of this phrase, but I just immediately Googled it, and it says it appears in Upanishad, Mahapanishad. So would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, you see, this question had come a couple of years back to us about the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We tried locating it in some texts, etc. The only source that we could find is in a particular story in Panchatantra. I'm not sure whether it exists in Upanishad, how it is being used. I have no clue. The way in which Panchatantra it gets used is hilarious. I mean, if you want to take that as a management principle of India, I mean, it is quite difficult for me. People would laugh at me if I take that as a story. So. Yeah,
I'm not aware of the source, but
yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, I would like to invite the second speaker, Professor Kozhikode.
Yeah, so this is the title of my talk. So I'm very worried or very interested about ethics, how ethics can be imbibed. And I think that's a very difficult problem in today's world. If you look at the business and management maybe 30 years ago, so we kind of thought that ethics is redundant because we have made systems with checks and balances, incentives and disincentives, so that everybody will kind of act as organizational interest, and that's how it will be solved. So that was, so we have a book, one particular book. So there are different books, I'll not name it, but basically the idea is we have mankind, we have reached a plane where we are kind of doing a very homogeneous society. All differences will be ironed out by these economic institutions and everything like that. But now what is happening, last a few years, ethics has come back to the discussion again. So first we have this subprime crisis that happened 2007 to 9, and many papers discuss the issues. What is the root cause of this problem? But everybody acknowledges lack of ethics rather, is one of the key things that is responsible for this crisis. Obviously, the problem of corruption is kind of too omnipresent in India, and we know, right, how political movements were shaped by perceived corruption in India, only on the one issue, that we want clarity, and that's the only issue of the entire party, and that's how these political movements arise. And recently we have this Me Too issue that is shaking up different fields, right? Particularly entertainment industries, So where basically it is found out that professionalism has gone to the back door, and lot of ethics is making unprofessional standards in those industries. So I mean so this ethics is rather secondary. That is not any relevant anymore. It is very primary importance for a healthy society. So what happened after the subprime crisis? We are responding also to an extent. We're not very sure how effective the responses are, but we are responding in our own way. So American Economic Association, so they have introduced an ethics declaration. So you have to declare, I have not taken money from doing this and that, and who will profit from my research and all these kind of things. A big declaration. Similar things have been done in business schools, ethics courses. I hope no business ethics teacher is here, business school ethics teacher is here, but being introduced, because ethics is important, so you have to teach it in the business schools. And then journals, we had a journal of business ethics, so we said, well, it's important, what do we do? Oh, well, its rank is here, we push it up further so that it becomes every important to every one of us. So that is kind of the way people are responding. Now, I'll go to this framework Professor Balu he has discussed in his book, Reconceptualizing India Studies in 2012. So there are two kinds of ethical domains based on the culture. So the word ethics is actually a little loaded because it requires a theory-based domain, where this is it. Someone said in the last session's panel discussion. So like this is it, this is the ideal state, it is there, this is called ethics, you try to imitate it. The other one is an empirical way. So we learn through our conduct from the society in our all appearances. So that is another way of learning ethics. So one very interesting incident, when the Western, and this is described by Balu, so when the Westerners came here, one idea was there, these Eastern cultures, India and Chinese, we don't have any ethics. Why we don't have any ethics? Because there is nothing here that says you ought to do something. So this ought to, this word is not also, some say that it doesn't have, many Chinese experts, they say it doesn't exist in the classical Chinese language. This word is missing. We have a Governor General, Lord Curzon. He ruled in India, and in a speech in Calcutta, I think it was 1904 or something, he said the respect for truth is much more among the Westerners compared to the Easterns. We kind of shocked at the British arrogance. We protested loudly. And I mean, the historians will tell. And then to respond to our protest, mostly it was Bengalis who protested. So Bengal was partitioned into two parts. That's history. But when Curzon said that, he did not say, I mean, so the response from Indians were that sorry. So the response from the Indians were that it is very British arrogance, and they pointed out to Lord Curzon's own autobiography, where he said that he actually lied to the Korea, where he was a diplomat in Korea, and in Korea apparently the more aged you are, more respect you get. So he increased his age a few years to the Korean king so that he gets more respect. So we are kind of protesting, oh well, he is lying, how can he say that? But the idea is he's just saying the idea of his times in the West, that we don't have an ethics, that's why respect for truth must be less in India. So that's kind of the way. So obviously we, thou shalt not commit adultery, this kind of way, it was not so much there, it is more of a theory-based construct. Now, how would you inculcate ethics in a society? So that ways will actually differ. In a theory-based society, we probably will kind of given you some text, which should be done, which should not be done. And, we'll give a story, and then in the story, this should not be done, this kind of way. And if you do that, then it will be bad. So if you do, if you one idea, one proverb that kind of summarizes this idea, it is often told by the teachers, follow my words, don't follow me. That means what is important is the ideal state, my words. How I conduct myself is not very important. In an empirics-based society, it will be other way around. You cannot say that. So you have to follow the teacher. I learn from the teacher how he is behaving. So one way that we have this Gurukula system where the students are mandated to stay with the teacher so that they observe the teacher, and from the teacher they develop their conduct. I mean, that is the way ethical domains, you inculcate ethics in a student. In an empirical ethical domain, that is the way you might inculcate ethics in a student. So these are two different ways of doing things. I'm not saying which is superior or inferior, but these are simply two different ways. So the research question is, does a theory-based ethical training work well in an empirics-based society? And it has really, really important consequences. Whenever there is an ethical failure in India, we look forward to a business course, right? In an ethics course in business school, an ethics course in school, an ethics course in the first year of doing bachelor's, an ethics course in, for the taxi drivers, all this kind of way. But does this course, I mean, just teach, you should do this, you should do this, does it mean anything? Or is it simply just an excuse for get away without responsibility? So that's why it is very much important. So we have conducted this survey. The consensus is ethics is kind of developed more during childhood compared to the adulthood kind of thing. So we wanted to look at the young minds, how they are kind of trained. So we looked into a religion teaching school in a particular religious commodity in India. So we have done a survey. They in that school, I mean, I'll describe the school a little later. They teach ethics in some one day of the week, and they do it there. But before going there, what should be the outcome of that course? That outcome of this course should be a student must have a sense, right? What is desirable, what is expected, what is not expected. It should create respect for the code of conduct expected of someone, right? If I am expected to honor someone, I must develop respect for that kind of conduct. If you can say it in another way. So, we face different situations in life. Sometimes we are battling for survival, battling for something serious. Sometimes it is normal day of affairs. So could it be said that same violation in our conduct will be considered a stronger violation of ethics if someone violates ethics, that behavior when survival is not at stake? Can it be said that? And someone violates that in a normal situation, that is kind of I think I should be other way around. When the survival is kind of at stake and we are making a violation, it's a weaker violation. And when the survival is at stake, it is a stronger violation. I think so. Many cultures may say so. In the Western culture, law is basically a manifestation of ethics in a society. One of the elements of law is property rights. So they assign different property rights to different friends. And these property rights, they grant exemption to infringement in emergency situation. I give an example. So if I intrude in your, in your garden, in your house, I take your boat, these are bad things and I'll be punishable. But what if I am battling for survival, a storm is coming and I might drown. I just take your boat, land in your garden and go away with it. And there's a very famous British president, and they kind of said, well, you are in survival at stake, so you can be granted exemption even though violation of property rights is there. So this was discussed by Harold themselves as a case study. There is also same thing we find in Red Indian traditions. So in the Red Indian traditions, a tribe cannot hunt beaver in the other tribe's land. So lands are kind of somewhat understandable that this tribe has a right over that. So this is chronicled by an anthropologist, Eleanor Lecoq. The Red Indians, they should not hunt the beaver in other lands because there's a lot of consequences, economic consequences, that the weavers far a kind of important source of revenue for those Red Indians, that was, and they should not, impoverish the other tribe. But there is a golden law, golden rule kind of thing. Suppose a tribe is coming, they are kind of starving, and somehow to get away from their hunger, they kind of kill a weaver. What about it? Well, it is allowed, but you have to leave the far and tail behind, to show that your motive or intent was just to kind of satisfy your hunger, not to kind of impoverish the other tribe. Again, if you look at India, same thing is there, the situational ethics. It is written by Dharampal, a Gandhian thinker. It is also quoted by Claude Alvarez. So Dharampal was traveling in a train, and he saw different people are going for pilgrimage. They are not interested in Delhi, they are not interested in Mumbai, they are going to pilgrimage. This is in the late 1950s or 60s. And they are carrying their food also from home, and they are taking the very sacred things, food in the traditional Indian culture, whatever we understand it, that Indian culture within quotes. But in India, it is not usually common for one jati, or it is roughly translated as caste, to take food of the other person. So, but they are all going together, so they are taking food from this post. So Dharampal thought that they must be from the same jati. They asked him, are you from the same jati? No, we are from different jatis. Well, then how come you kind of do it? They say, well, it is allowed. When you are doing a journey and you are doing an emergency, we are allowed to do that. So again, if you consider that taking food from your jati as a part of ethics, there is a situational ethics in place. When survival is at stake during journey or during some emergency, it is allowed to be violated. Other times it's not. So I kind of summarize it. In the situations related to survival, a lower level of conduct is considered ethical, where in a non-survival related situation, a higher level of conduct is considered ethical. So if ethics varies across situations, we can state alternatively the same unethical deed in different situations, same unethical deed, but in different situations. So in a survival kind of situation, it will be considered more ethical. In a non-survival related situation, it will be considered less ethical or more unethical. Yeah. So what we have done, we went to this religion teaching school. They have like different classes from standard 1 to 12, and every one day of the week, students go there. They are 2 hours. They are taught all these kind of things, and exams are also held for promotion to the next class. Certificates are also issued. These certificates they use for community purposes, marriage and everything, but not for for regular jobs and other things. They are not very useful. So we talked to the basically my co-authors, Remia and Jacob. They went to them, and this priest and headmaster, they noted, like they actually we kind of discussed with them. So they said that students, there's a heavy tendency of copying from each other in this exam, where this kind of this course is taught. So we asked the students different questions. The respondents were like 55 students, average age is like this. So we asked them different questions. So if you ask these questions, do you copy? Obviously everyone will say, well, no, we don't copy, we don't smoke, we don't do any bad things. So we kind of ask them, what is your attitude? If someone copies, do you understand that? In this situation you are copying, do you understand that? I know. How would you think, copying this can be okay? So they have answers like often, sometimes we understand, often we understand, a few times I understand, never do I understand, something like that. And so these questions were here. I'll show you for time. So we asked these questions in 2 contexts, in the regular school context, in the religion teaching school context. And it was found out the attitude is almost the same. So they are saying, well, they are saying well, copying in school is all right because you need to good grades, otherwise the parents will smack you. They are the same thing there about this religion teaching also, which is basically to give them ethics. They are saying, well, copying is okay in this school because this is not very important, something like that. And this is a little surprising because this has no relation to your career, your prospect in life, in some sense. But still, they are doing the same code of conduct that they are pursuing for the regular school. So cheating in a regular school exam may be related to this career and success in life, but that you cannot say on a religion teaching school, which is pretty informal in some sense. Obviously, they have certificates and other things, but they are not important in the regular job market. So if you have situational ethics in mind, so cheating in a regular exam is more ethical compared to cheating in a religion teaching school examination. So they are they are taking a course that is supposed to imbibe with them ethics, but in their conduct, they are showing anything but more unethical than the regular conduct. So in a way, this is a failure, I think. So I would say that effect of theory-based ethics course is dubious. So when you talk about introduce a course and introduce a course here and there for failure in ethics, we don't know the outcome. Obviously, this is one study. We need more study. Possibly we should look at basically ethnographic kind of way. We stay with this person for some time and we should see whether this is increasing ethics or decreasing ethics, how these things is happening. Well, you will ask, what about the other kind of way, ethics? The problem is there is a lot of valid samples. So this is the other way of, conduct schools and things are almost absent in India. Some plans are there. We have done some pilot studies, but nothing major has happened. So I would like to conclude at this. If you have a question, I'll be very happy to answer.
How would you differentiate between ethics and social norms? For example, that of you must be from the same jati anecdote that you picked up was adherence or non-adherence to a social norm. In what way would this apply to an ethical framework? Is social norms the same as ethics?
So this is actually, actually a very nice point you made. So the idea of ethics is some ideal conduct that should be there. So this is coming from a theory-based culture, as Balu told. So basically, in a theory-based culture, it has to be written, codified. So this is the ideal case, and you are having this ethics. But in an empiric society, we don't have anything like that. So, but there is a social norm that gives you roughly the idea how you should behave, right? The social norms tell you, well, if you can smoke, but you cannot smoke in front of your father. So then it becomes a part of your ethics kind of thing, and we learn from that. So in other words, I would like to say in an ethical domain, an empirics-based ethical domain, social norms would act as a kind of a ethics, in some sense ethics for that kind of society.
The second is on your research, when you say a school which was religion teaching school, again, there is this assumption that a religion teaching school is imparting concepts of ethics. While what it might be doing is a particular philosophy. So again, is philosophy equal to ethics? There is...
So I agree to you. So I cannot assume that definitely that religion teaching school is doing its job. But what I try to say that when you ask this person, religion teaching school, what is the purpose of having this school? I think the answer would unanimously come. The idea is to make this person a more ethical person. That I think everybody will kind of agree on that. So that way, on their purpose, I'm just taking their purpose on their face.
Hello, sir. So my question is that I agree. So there are a few situations where the decisions can be made on basis of some norms, where I completely agree that empirical based methods can work. But there are a few situations, especially in businesses, where it is not really on basis of some norms, the decision cannot be made. Both sides of the argument can be justified in one way or the other. So in such situations, how can someone be taught ethics when the person who is teaching himself is not sure which side of the argument is right?
Exactly what I'm saying, no? So when there is a conflict of two sides, suppose X and Y, a theory-based ethics course would say X is above Y. Suppose you have to respect between your parents and between someone else's parents. A theory-based ethics course will say, well, you have to obey your parents first and other parents later. But in an empiric situation, it might not be so. You will observe how things evolve here, and then upon you kind of do it. So there is a story by Confucius. So Confucius once told that our village is very, very good. Why? Well, this father did some mistake and son reported to this kind of authority. Confucius said, well, no, I'm not favor of such a dramatic thing. There must be something unsure going on here. So he's saying, he's disputing there's a social norm present that time of in China, where the child should not contradict the parent. So he's saying, well, he is maybe adhering to some idea of righteousness or something, but this is not the social norm. So in a way, he is violating it.
So in empirical based method, should we leave it on the individual to learn from his own experiences, or is it that there is a way to, through experiences, we can teach someone also that maybe at the early stage of life?
Anyway, learn that. Whether you particularly devise a system like that or not, you will always learn, right? When you come on this earth, how do you learn to do things? Well, I watch, at my smartphone all the time. So it looks very ethical to my kids, and they also look at that way. So when I go to school, what the other people are doing, that looks natural to me. I follow that. So whether you say it or not, we will anyway do it. But the question is, should systems be geared towards more human nature, or should they be have a different kind of imposition on us?
How can we teach ethics? How can we teach ethics? But
No, I never said that. I said there are two ways to teach it.
no, I'm not saying you. The participant this side. My experience of teaching ethics since last 4 years is that I do not enter the classroom by saying I am here to teach you ethics. I just say, you can ask my students, we all are ethical by nature. I am here to tell you what are the ethical schools of thoughts are here, and you choose yours. But the pervasive constraint is we cannot harm anyone consciously. Both the words. And secondly, they ask me after every case study that you are not taking a stand. And I usually tell them that if I take a stand, then it will be like ideology selling. How I can say what is right for you, because you are already ethical. You have forgotten or you have suspended it for some time, and that's fine. But when they push me to a corner, I say I am an adherent of ethics of duty by Immanuel Kant. But we cannot claim that we are here to teach ethics when we know all the human beings by nature are ethical. Human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kaushik sir. Now we have the next presenter, Professor Jacob de Roever from Belgium University, from Ghent University, Belgium. He is a prominent researcher at the Cultural Science, Comparative Science of Culture. He has many well-accomplished publications in prominent journals. His latest book is Europe, India, and Limits of Secularism by Oxford University. May I please request Professor Jacob de Roever come. He will be talking about the topic about the management in temple management. Thank you.
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There's two problems I'm facing this afternoon. The first is I like to preach. I love to preach for hours on end. We won't go into where I learned that, where I picked this up. The second problem is, in the pre-lunch session, Chaitra was so kind to give half of my talk, without being aware of it, of course. Now, the fortunate thing is that the second problem cancels out the first problem. I can keep it brief. Last June, the Supreme Court of India gave a direction, gave an order to the central government and to the Orissa government to establish a committee that should study management of temples, the management practices and schemes of the temples. And this happened in the context of a case about the Jagannath temple in Puri. And the Supreme Court said should study the management of temples like that of Dharmasthala in Karnataka or that of Tirupati to be able to solve the problems of the Jagannath temple in Puri. Well, I think most of you will know that the so-called question of temple management has been central in Indian society at least since 1947. Because since that period, state-level governments have taken over the administration of all Hindu temples which they consider public. They're controlling finances, practical organization, but also supervising rituals and ceremonies. Well, along the way, what they frequently do is point out the mismanagement of the temples that would traditionally happen by the heads and the pujaris of the temple, and this becomes a reason for asking for more government control. So basically what you see is discussions about temple management in the past decades have taken place in the legislative assemblies and the courts of law. Now this is surprising. What is surprising about it? Well, there's been a debate going on which we have referred to several times during this conference about the link between Indian culture and management. Is there an Indian way of management? How can Indian culture contribute to management theories today? And there's roughly two routes that have been taken. One is you study how Indian CEOs and companies behave. The second is you study ancient Indian texts and claim that they give management lessons for today. Now, whatever may be the value of those studies, there's a lacuna we should notice. Because if you want to know about the link between Indian culture and management, one of the first places you could look to is the traditional cultural organizations of India. And here, the temple is the most important place, it would seem, the most important kind of organization or institution. If you look at the temple as an organization, it is highly complex. Chaitra described the number of people, the number of groups of people involved in the organization, the kinds of tasks, the different pujas, the different ornaments and materials that are needed. Water has to be drawn from different wells. So this is a highly complex organization where cooperation and interaction among different kinds of groups has to be coordinated so that tasks are performed well. It's in this context that we should highlight a fact. The temple, the Indian temple, is probably the most ancient organization of this level of complexity that has survived to this day. It's older than the Roman Catholic Church, than the Roman Republic, and it has survived all kinds of circumstances. Wars, conflicts, changes of ruler. It has survived extremely hostile circumstances. Islamic conquests and rulers who looked at the temples as centers of false religion and devil worship, which should actually be destroyed. The British, who looked at the temples in much the same way, as sites of false religion, but where they could draw income from and revenue from. And perhaps the most hostile environment is post-independence India, where state-level governments have taken over control of the temples and transformed them into bureaucratic structures. Now, in spite of all these hostile circumstances, the temples have survived. And from this, we can infer that they must be highly adaptable, highly resilient, and highly successful forms of organization. Still, as a form of organization, temple has hardly been studied in any serious way. And there's some anthropological literature or historical literature on specific temples, some old jurisprudential works about religious endowments, and some ancient treatises in Agama Shastra. But management specialists and social scientists have hardly looked into the temples to study them as a successful form of organization. The people who have discussed temple management, as I said before, are politicians and judges. Now, what happens when you leave this task to politicians and judges? Well, look at India during the past centuries, in fact, because this happened with the British, started with the British. Let me just take the Jagannath Temple as an example. British began to interfere there in 1809 for several reasons, but mainly because they wanted to draw on the pilgrim taxes and the income of the temple. And what did they do? They split up the role of the Raja of Puri, his ritual role as Adya Sevak, or head servant of the temple, from his role as superintendent of the temple, which was supposed to be a secular role. And they said, since this is secular, the government can take over and we'll supervise his superintendence. So what this meant is a district collector of the Board of Revenue, the East India Company, took control of this temple and began to draw revenue from the temple and remove the Raja when he opposed this. A post-independence period, you basically see this continue. What have the state-level governments done? Created legislation which allows them to take over whatever they consider secular in the functioning of the temple. They leave a small part that is supposed to be religious, namely performance of particular rituals, to people who are not part of government bureaucracy. And this transforms the temples into bureaucratic organizations that happen to deal in rituals and ceremonies instead of, say, liquor licenses or land records. One of the things that happens very frequently is referring to mismanagement as a justification for this way of working. So what do they say? There's mismanagement, fraud, all kinds of misdemeanor inside the temple, so therefore we need laws that will see to a better administration. Now, what is this notion of mismanagement? There's something strange going on there. Usually, something is being mismanaged, or when there's fraud, we would expect specific laws to come into play to examine whether fraud really took place, to examine who's guilty of that fraud, who's guilty of, say, mismanagement, and then try to remedy it. In this case, the way that's being talked is as though the mismanagement can only be addressed by having more and more control by government bureaucrats over whatever happens in the temple. But this becomes reasonable when we look at where this notion of mismanagement comes from, mismanagement in temples, because it comes from the British colonials and their story about the temples as houses of false religion and devil worship. The British, as Protestant Christians, looked at the temple pujaris as the priests of false religion, who were basically under the influence of the devil and were there for themselves. They just want to use religion to enrich themselves and deceive and mislead the believers, the devotees. Now, that story for the British became a reason to interfere in temples like Jagannath Temple. And if you look at it, this is what several state governments have been repeating, several judges have been repeating in the past 7 decades. Now, this means that what these governments are doing and judges are doing is implicitly accepting a story that pujaris and others in the temples are the representatives and followers of false religion and the devil, even though they would never explicitly say that because they don't know this is where their story about mismanagement and fraud comes from. Now, if this is mismanagement, and if your notion of mismanagement is so poor, what is good management of temples? If you look at what the state has done, apart from drawing on this story about fraud and mismanagement, it also points out that there's all kinds of problematic practices going on in the temples. So basically, Hinduism, they say, has sanctioned all kinds of revolting practices, such as devdasis, not giving entry to the temples to untouchables or to women of a particular age. And these are considered as immoral practices, which Hinduism will not change by itself, so therefore the state has to come in and reform Hinduism and ban these practices, allow people into temples, stop devdasi practices from continuing. Again, if you look at this story, simply repetition of British description of the false religion of India, which sanctions all kinds of evil practices. The British at least said, since this is false religion, we cannot get our hands too dirty by touching it all that much. Now, today's politicians and bureaucrats in India don't have that problem because they don't explicitly see it as false religion, so they can keep expanding the intervention in the temples. The good management here is basically kind of parroting of the values of the liberal democratic secular state, which means neutrality, liberty, equality are the important values, and the state should bring these in. So bureaucrats are neutral, they're religiously neutral, politically neutral, so therefore they should come in and manage the temples. All these practices, for instance, in Shabarimala, not allowing women entry, that's a violation of equality and freedom of worship, so therefore the state should come in and ban this practice. Along the way, when you read the judgments of the Supreme Court or the High Courts, I mean, at least any Western European student of law, we've done this experiment, is completely shocked by the use of these notions. The way freedom of religion is being talked about is unrecognizable. The right to worship, as Balu pointed out yesterday, is talked about in a completely incoherent way. human rights in general, basically judges are bullshitting about human rights. And they'll say stuff like, the founder of human rights is John Stuart Mill or John Locke or this and that, not realizing that this concept of human rights comes out of a debate internal to the Roman Catholic Church between two monastic orders. And it was a debate about whether or not monks could have property. This is what gave rise to the notion that human beings have natural rights. So this is a verbiage, a way of talking that's picked up, used in completely incoherent ways and cavalier ways, without taking into account any of the consequences. Because there are consequences, and that's what we've seen the past decades. When you draw on the Constitution and say the Constitution allows the state to regulate any secular activity associated with religious practice, so therefore freedom of religion is limited to very supposedly well-delineated religious practices, that you simply allow the state and the government to more and more move into these temples by saying that's secular, this is not religion, this is actually secular. If we look at Supreme Court judgments, that's what the judges have done. So you would say, okay, Seva Puja at least is a religious practice, right? You cannot interfere there. So what do the judges say? Well, not really. This puja has a religious dimension and a secular aspect. So the government, if it wants to check on how the puja is being done, this is not religious. This is a secular task of supervising how the puja is done. Since you're not participating, you're not doing the puja yourself, it's still secular. And here in Kerala, this is the way the entire issue of who could be a priest in a temple has been discussed. I leave alone that it doesn't make sense to speak of priests there, but when a new law was introduced, which said basically that anyone based on merit should be able to become a priest in public temples, and not just, say, Nambudri Brahmins, this was challenged as intervening in the freedom of religion of these people, of the priests and of the temples. Now, what did judges say? Well, actually, it's not at all that, because even though performing the rituals might be religious, the people performing them are secular persons. So therefore, the state can decide who should be employed as a priest. And what it did is you just have to pass some test that shows you're able to perform certain ritual actions. Schools were started for that. And now these pujaris have become clerks of the government, or that's what they look like. It's as though you've created ritual pushers in the image of paper pushers. So people can be moved from one temple to the other temple. They're moved around like government servants. The question is this good management? Well, if you look at the consequences, it cannot be good management. If you just compare two temples, the Jagannath temple, where government intervention has been maximal, has been going on since 1809, British colonials, very extensively. This is the temple that keeps coming up in legal disputes as the temple where there's mismanagement, fraud, where the sevaks are basically cheats, conmen, who try to cheat on the pilgrims and the devotees. This is where the government has intervened maximally. If you compare that to, say, a temple like that of Dharmasthala, there's been hardly any such disputes. To such an extent that now the Supreme Court itself says that to solve the problems of the temple of Jagannath, you have to go and study Dharmasthala to find out what is going well there, which is going wrong in Puri. Of course, these committees, what they're going to do is come up with some best practices. That's predictable. As though the management of temples is about having the right kinds of fences to lead the pilgrims around, or having CCTV to check on the sevakas in the Jagannath temple. Now, this is where you see what happens when bureaucrats, politicians, and judges begin to address the question of temple management. And this is also why it's high time that social scientists begin to look into this question in a very serious way. Because what's happening today is where the Muslim rulers and the British failed, namely destroying temples on a massive scale, the post-independent state-level governments of India are succeeding more and more. Now, if we take seriously what Chaitra said earlier today, that the temple as a form of organization shows us how in India management, when it takes the form of coordinating patterns of interaction and cooperation between the stakeholders of this organization, between the pujaris and sevakas, the pilgrims, devotees, different jatis involved in supplying everything that the temple needs, many other groups of stakeholders that are involved. If the temples were indeed successful in creating these patterns of interaction, which they seem to have been because they survived for such a long time, then we need to begin to study temple management in a serious way as social scientists. Instead of leaving it to judges and politicians who are basically taking measures that break down these patterns of interaction, because that's what you see happen. The more government control has expanded, the more the patterns of interaction begin to break down. The more disputes come into being. More legal conflicts come into being. Now, last minor point, well, it's not minor, but I'll keep it brief. We also know that temples, to a large extent, revolve around rituals. And one of the things that's been transmitted over all this time are the rituals. Again, this is where the government keeps expanding its intervention. Again, this is where we see that something is going wrong. So therefore, if the temples should be saved, and if we have to gain knowledge about this very fascinating form of organization, it's high time we begin to study these organizations. Thank you.
Called Academy of Learning, in which there was a Indian professor who died in 2004, Sumantra Ghosal. He had written an article with this title, that how bad management theories are spoiling or destroying good management practices. And in that, he's talking about something, when you are talking about bad management, he's talking about something that the modern management sciences has systematically avoided studying intention, human intention, because that is where they are finding the last frontier to conquer. So without intention, as per the Western science, or consciousness as we call it here, no management can be complete. So I do not know if it is bad management, but management per se without intention is partial. So even if we are talking here, or I am saying that I am a professor of management, but I question myself that am I competent enough to teach management. So just when you were talking about this bad management, just wanted to share this bit of information with you.
Hello. Sir, have you looked at the political economic aspect of this temple cases? And like in India, the courts are not all democratic. So they can be basically said about an extension of government because we don't elect our judges, and it's smoke and mirrors kind of thing. They are elected beyond between four walls. And a considerable amount they take up court cases, so they take up time for other cases, and it costs money. And then again, when we are saying that they are taking up, like priests are government servant, so basically we are seeing an increase in the size of bureaucracy. So I don't know, has anybody looked into that aspect? The political economic side. How the expenditure of government has increased in that respect.
I don't know if anyone has looked into it. I haven't looked into it. But you shouldn't make confusion. Judges are not elected in many parts of the world. For instance, in my country, judges are not elected, they're appointed. That doesn't mean that they're not independent. So I don't think the fact that judges are not elected is the problem here. There's another problem in the functioning of the judiciary, which we don't understand as of yet. So I wouldn't look for these easy explanations. But the political economical side, no. I can only say that the facts that I come to learn are often very shocking from my perspective. For instance, last week I read in the newspaper that in a case of the Shirdi Sai Baba shrine, Devendra Fadnavis, who's a BJP chief minister, basically he needed 500 crore rupees, 500 crore rupees for an irrigation scheme, and he didn't have the budget. So the chairman of the committee that's governing the Shirdi Sai Baba shrine, another BJP politician, said, no problem, we'll give you an interest-free loan of 500 crore rupees without any clarity on when you have to return the money, no problem. So when these kinds of things happen, it's worth studying, that's for sure.
Very small interlude here. I was researching on Jataka tales. So there I found one post, Dharma Arth Anushashak. In the story part, this is Dharma Arth Anushashak means something like a judge which is a financial advisor also and a Dharma advisor also. So in the ancient India, probably this post was there at least in Varanasi kingdom, Varanasi Rashtra as they call, in that Rashtra this post was there. So this state intervention, as you rightly told, it depends, at which way it should function. But this is not something very unheard of. From the ancient texts if we take, there was a post like this, and this responsibility was with the state to regulate and keep it under the norms. Thank you. Just a piece of information, and maybe you can use it in somewhere for your research and further on temple management.
See, the fact that rulers were involved in the temples as organizations is true. Say in the case of Jagannath Temple, it's very clear that the local Raja always played an important role in the temple. What he did not do was begin to intervene and regulate the temple through a series of laws or regulations and take over control there in such a way that there's breakdown of the organization more and more. So from this alone, we know there's a huge difference between what traditionally happened, the role that rulers played in the functioning of the temple, and what is happening today. Because this is often given as another justification, that post-independent state is just, and the British also, were just continuing what had always been the case, namely that these were, well, government-controlled entities. I don't think that's true at all.
Yeah, okay, I understand your position on the interference of government and the judiciary in the management of temples. But let us say for the, I'm just going to ask you, if it is, temples do not function in a vacuum. They function as part of societies. There are parts of where the temple is on land, it's around communities which are also affected by the work of that temple. You take Varanasi, for example. The entire, let's leave the argument as who's polluting it more, whether it is corporate or whether it's temples. But let's assume there is a part of temple ritual materials that fall and pollute, and therefore that part of it is badly managed. Therefore, it affects not just the temple, it affects a series of people all around the temple who inhabit. It affects life outside the temple. In such a situation, considering that the land outside the temple and the communities outside the temple are not the temple's own responsibility in the way it seems to see it, who will do all this work of managing the ecosystem around the temple? If you look at it in a more of a kind of community kind of way.
Very brief. I mean, we have, today there's environmental law for that, right? If a company does it, a private company, they can be punished and brought before the courts. So if a temple does that, that could also happen, and problems could be solved in that way. But it doesn't mean that government would take over companies completely because they violate environmental law. In the same way, I don't see why that should be a reason for this extensive government intervention.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank you all the presenters for sharing their ideas and views. Now I would like to request our session chair to hand over the certificates to all the presenters. May I request MS Chattri sir for coming onto the stage and receiving the certificate for his sharing his thoughts on where is culture in cross-culture management. Thank you, sir. Next, I would like to request Professor Kozhikode for coming to the stage and receiving the certificate for how effective is theory-based learning of ethics in India. Thank you, sir. Next, I would like to request Professor Jacob D. Rover to come to the stage and receive the certificate for About the Management in Temple Management. Finally, I would request Professor S.N. Balagangadhar, popularly known as Professor Balu, please come on the stage. And hand over the certificate to session chair. And please hand over the memento also, sir. Thank you, Professor Balagangadhar. Thank you, everyone, and we can go ahead and have tea and snacks.